Now with this, we have created an iterator function that allows us to iterate over objects. Now we can use for of now to iterate over objects and log their values. We can iterate over this object and then we'll log the values named 30 and married. So this line will now work. It will no longer throw user is not iterable. Rather, it will work very fine and log these values here. Let's try it. Node test. So you see, we log everything inside the user object. We log everything there. So this is how it's done. Yeah. Now able to set our symbol.iterator on an object prototype, get the properties, return an object that contains a next function. Then this next function must be an arrow function so that you can be able to access this. This is the object that is called on this object. So that's why we used an arrow function here. So we're able to get the object first, then also get the keys, save the properties, an array, then loop through them in each iteration. This next is called, and we return the value, current value in the properties, increment the index, get the current element, pass it to value, then pass is done to the done property. This done tracks whether we have exhausted the properties in the object. So when we are done with it, we'll pass done through and the iteration stops. That's why I say the iteration stopped at this. So if we set more properties here, like for example, let's say school, let's add school, say unizik, say eye color, say black. Now can run it, it will log everything for us too. So you see it logs all the values of the properties there for us. Now we can also tinker with this. We can also say let's return all the keys in the object. Like we don't want to return the values, we just want to return the keys. So simple, this is what we have to do. We will now remove this here, then I'll simply return it like this. So you see, this returns all the properties there. So now also, if you want to return both the property and the keys, we will have to do it like this. First, we replace this, then we'll have to add here the current property, current index. Now we'll now come to this value, remove it. Instead, let's now return an object instead. So we'll now write property name, all right, current property, then we'll now write property value will now be the current element. So we return them so we can see what they are side by side. So you see, so you can tinker with this and do it and return whatever style you want. We can also tinker with the array prototype and tinker with it to return anything we want. So the power, then mind you, this works for every object defined after this. So after this line, every object defined here is now iterable. Above it, it will not work because JavaScript has not yet processed this. Now we have learned how to add iterator to object. And also we have learned how to add iterator to data types that are not iterable. Now, let's look at how we can iterate on ESC classes. Now remember, ESC brought us the ability to create a class in JavaScript using the class keyword. Now let's take, for example, we have this class profiles, then a constructor, and this takes an array of profiles that we can now store in a member variable profiles. Now let's create an object of it. And I'll say profiles assignment operator followed by the new keyword profiles. Then we'll now add an array of profiles. Like for example, let's say Namdi. So in fact, let's make it a two-dimensional array so that each array in the main array represents the profile of a student. Let's see, age 30, and create another array that holds Ibuka age 20. So now if we try to run for off on these profiles, let's write profiles here, then a profile, and try to log it profile. Yeah. Then let's clear this. Now let's run it. You will see it will tell us that the profiles is not iterable. So a class in JavaScript is not iterable. Now we can get creative with this, then to make this our class profiles to be iterable. So what do we have to do? Simple, we need to add the symbol iterator. Then where do we add it? Simple, we add it inside the class here. We do something like this: symbol dot iterator. We add it here, then it's a function, then the brace. Now inside here is now where we do our iteration logic. This makes the class derived from these profiles to be an iterable, so we can look through it via for of. So simple, we use our logic. First we return an object that contains a next function. You remember in our previous custom iteration that we built. Now it depends to us now what we want to iterate over and return to for of, or to whatever is calling our iterator symbol. Now we have a profile as an array, so we can just simply return each and every one of the arrays passed to our profiles. So first we'll capture the profiles, this dot profiles. So we capture it, then we'll set index, our index, to track the iteration, then set our is done like we have always done, to track when we are done and to return it. Then remember this next, let's first add it, returns an array, or returns an object, sorry, then the value and done. Now let's assign done to is done first. Now this is where we add our iteration. Now you know that when we are, this is pointing to this first array. So what we have to do now is get the elements, get the current element like this. Now we'll now say profiles to the current index. Now we increase the index. Next we'll add the if logic. So say if current index is greater than the array length, means in this case profiles.length, we will make is done to be true. So we copy current element, assign it to value. So we are done with the logic. So as you can know, this simple dot iterator makes this class, the object derived from this class profiles, to be iterable. It loops through the profiles that we pass into. The profiles here is an object, is an array, sorry. Then we'll look through it, we'll get it here using the this dot profiles gets the profiles here. Then we assign it to this profiles variable. Then we set our variables that tracks the iteration, the current index of iteration, and when it's done. So inside this next function, we get the profiles via the current index, save it here, increment the current index. Now check if the current index is greater than the profiles length. We know that we are done with it. Then we set is done to true. Then this next returns an object with value set to the current element, what we got from the profiles array. Then done to is done through here. So that's everything about this iterator. Remember, this should be an arrow function so that we cannot misplace the this keyword if we want to use it inside here. So if we use the this inside keyword, we now have to hit the this in this class as a whole, not in the function. So that's why we use the array function there. So we have set everything and the for loop here. So now let's try it out. So this here, we'll have to log this first and second this. Now let's try it. Node test. So you see, we'll log it here, the first, second. So you see that we are now able to log or to iterate over an object derived from a class. Now let's look at what we call async iterator. You know, previously we have all been looking at an iterator. Now async iterator is what we use to iterate over async values. Now let's see what it is. Let's first clear this. Then let's say we have an array of promises like this. Then in each item we have a promise, then we have result, and the result resolves, let me say for now this one resolves to a string. Now we have another ones that, let me say this one resolves to 30, then this one resolves to married. Now let's iterate over it using the for of. Array of promises and then log it. Let's see what happens. You see, it iterates over them and logs the items. Now these items are promises. But what if we want a case whereby we want it also not to return the promises but resolve these promises and return the values in this case? So this is where we use the for await of statement. This for await of statement is a variation of this for of statement. This for await enables us to look through an array of async values, then return the resolved values of those async objects or values. Now let's see how to use this for await. Simple, we'll add the await here. Now this will not work. This will throw an error. This code like this will throw an error. We throw an error. Let's run it. One, because we need to wrap this inside an async function. We don't use this like this. We need to wrap it. So to do that, we need to set a function, then let's just name it resolve for off. Now inside this function, we'll copy this and paste it inside our function, then add async keyword there, so that we'll be able to use this await, because await goes with the async keyword, so that we can now be able to run and log this. So we'll now come down here and call the function like this. So let's run this. Let's clear this and then run it. See, it runs. So here the await, what this does is it will resolve all the async values being returned by the array and log or return the values there. So you see that we have the values of this promise. The first promise have the async value, the value of the second async object, a promise 30. Then we have the third one here. So this is what the for await of does. It's a variation of the for off statement. Now we have seen how to iterate over array of promises using for await of. Now let's look at what if. What if an object was here instead? An object was here and we want to iterate over it. Now let's remove this name for clarity purposes and add a async object, and also we change it here in the for await of. Now we have an async object here and we want to iterate over it. Now remember that an object is non-iterable. It cannot be iterated over using the for of. And to do it and to make it iterable, we need to use symbol.iterator. Symbol.iterator. So we need to specify the symbol.iterator property function to make an object to be iterable. But now this makes this object to be iterable over for of, not for await of. So this yet doesn't work. Now to be able to make an async object to be iterated using the for await of, we need to use now async iterator in this case. The iterator and async iterator are the same thing. They return the next an object with next function there. But now in this case, instead of returning this value with done like an object, it returns an async value of it instead. It returns an async value of it. So here we have result that resolves to it. So you see it. Instead of returning the object with value and done properties, it returns a promise that resolves to them. So in this case, we cannot iterate over it using the for await of. So now let's make this async object to return resolved values of these properties, name and age. So likewise, we do the same thing. What are we going to do? First, we get the properties like we did in the other one. We use object dot keys, then pass this, so we can be able to get this. Then, like we have done, set current index, then set is done to false. Then come here, then get the current element. Now refer it from the current properties, current index, then now reference it now from the this object. Now we increment the index like we have done, set the logic when current index is greater than properties.length, mark is done true. So here the value becomes current element and done become is done. So with this, we have made this async object to be able to be iterated over using the for await of and return the values in its properties, just like that. Now we can now call it like this, async object. So it will now log the properties. Okay, now let's try it out. Have to remove this. So everything is okay. Now we'll try it out. Node test. You see, we logged everything in this property. Everything is logged we use the for await of. So if we add more properties like this, then we log to still log all the properties there. So this is the end of the lesson. I hope you learned a lot from these lessons, starting from how to use the for of on iterable objects like arrays, set, map, string, argument objects, generator functions, then and also how to create custom iterators. Then down to how to create your own custom iterator and make an object to be iterable. Then down to for await of how to make async iterables and how to create your own custom iterables like we did here. So so feel free to recreate whatever we have in this video. Write your own custom iterators and async iterators. Then play with it. Return so many values in different forms so as you can understand what we did here. Remember, uh, learning without practicing doesn't upskill you that much, but once you try this out in your own, you learn a lot from it. You will definitely make some mistakes, but you learn a lot from it. Yeah, so that will make your skills to be up notch very fast, and you will learn very fast. Yes, so follow me on Twitter or X nowadays at ng angel. Then you have any questions and you want to reach me, you can reach me on my email called manga40@gmail.com. So thank you so much and see you soon.